All right, so tonight we're going to start a new Bible study that will carry us to Ash Wednesday. We will continue with prayer circle and Bible study like we did in Advent during Lent. We'll move it to Tuesdays like we did in Advent.
Good.
But we will be doing a different study then that is actually by Amy Jill Levine. And that one will be on entering the Passion. So it'll be a study that leads us into Holy Week and helps us appreciate it a little bit more. I'm also working on what we're going to do for Wednesdays. So until we get to Lent and Ash Wednesday, which happens to fall on Valentine's Day this year, that happened a couple years ago too. We will be studying the Gospel of Mark. The reason I chose that one was, one, I wanted us to get back into the Bible after our last study that talked about ways to read Scripture. And two, Mark is the Gospel that is our primary Gospel for this liturgical year, year B. It does get supplemented with the Gospel of John and Luke in places, and I think Matthew once or twice. But that's because Mark is a shorter gospel and doesn't have some of the same stories. So it's good for us to understand it a little bit more and cover some of the parts that aren't going to come up in the lectionary, and that unless you read through it, you'll never notice. So what I'm going to do tonight is give you a bunch of the background information. What did he call it in our book? I still have my Making Sense of Scripture nearby. Okay, so we're going to be doing the behind part, like the behind the scenes. So what's the historical situation that led to or affected the creation? And we're going to talk about some characteristics and who Mark was and that kind of thing. And that'll give us a good basis to actually start reading it. I will send you all tomorrow a reading list so you can know what we're going to be talking about each week. I just haven't broken that out in my mind yet because I was worried about getting the introduction done tonight. So let me move y'all over here. Bring up my outline. All right. So what do you know about the Gospel of Mark?
Well, it's
your least
originally the first book of the New Testament.
All right. Y'all were talking at the same time. So, Stephen,
I'm sorry.
What were you saying?
I said you said it was your least. We're still doing it. I'm going to shut up. Go ahead, Steve.
All right. Go ahead, Stephen.
It's originally the first book of the New Testament.
Okay.
And from what I understood, Mark was the one who went running through the night when Jesus was arrested, naked, screaming into the night. That's what.
So we're going to talk about that. All right. Barbara, what did you say?
I seem to recall you're saying it was your least favorite.
No, John is my least favorite. Mark is my most favorite.
Oh, I got it backwards. Okay.
Yeah. John is all mysticky and spiritual, and it's just too far out in left field for me a lot of the time. Mark is short, sweet, straight to the point. What else?
He tells certain stories in his book that are not in the other three Gospels.
He does, and the other three Gospels tell stories that he does not have. And that's partially because their focus is different. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes too. Anything else?
Was Mark a kid or a young man or
Well, we'll get to that part. All right. So first and foremost, Mark is the shortest of all of the four gospels that we have. Okay. By a considerable margin in most cases. And was most likely the very first gospel written. The language in the gospel appears deceptively simple. It's written in Koine Greek, which is the Greek that most of the New Testament is written in, right? Koine Greek was common Greek, so it was what they would speak in the markets and stuff. It was not the refined classical Greek of Plato or any of them. It was just like basic English with contractions and all that kind of stuff, right? What we would consider just regular conversation. Mark has the simplest appearing way of writing, but it actually is pretty deep when you get into it. He also keeps some Latin words in there, which our Bible translates out and we lose them, and some Aramaic words, which for whatever reason they chose to keep and not translate out, probably because Mark then explains what the translation means. So, everything from Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani to Talitha cum, which is little girl, get up. Things like that. What's most interesting about Mark when we're talking about kind of a background is the things that are missing. So what can you think of, just thinking of Mark, that is not there that is in other gospels? If you flip in your Bible to Mark 1, you should be able to guess that one pretty easily.
No birth
birth.
story.
Right?
No what?
No birth story. So Mark does not record, nor does he seem to care about any birth narrative for Jesus. That is not his concern. Instead, Matthew's so long. Get out of here. Instead, Mark begins the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. There, he's already told you everything you need to know. What is this? It's the good news of Jesus Christ. Who is he? He's the Son of God. Okay, and you could also say, Jesus the Messiah, because Christos, and Messiah are synonymous words in Greek and Hebrew. So they both mean anointed one. So, and then in verse 2, he immediately launches into quotations from the Old Testament, which he says come from the prophet Isaiah and only in part do. Some of it's from Isaiah and some of it's from Malachi, which we talked about a little bit before. Malachi. But there again, we see right off the bat that not only is Mark interested in telling us the good news of Jesus, the Savior of the world, who is the Son of God, but he also thinks that we should know and be familiar with the prophets, which means he regards Jewish scripture as being legitimate for Christians. Right? That probably wasn't a popular position when he was writing, because most Christian communities that were made up of a mix of Jews and Gentiles were going through separation processes with their particular synagogues, wherever they happen to be. And most of them were fairly messy. to the point that the Jews would sometimes call the Roman authorities on Christians and blame them for causing problems in the synagogue, which they probably were. And that actually starts some of the persecutions. So, all right, so no Christmas story. What else do you think might be missing?
The Transfiguration.
Now, Transfiguration's there. However, another incident on the mountain is not. Mark does, excuse me, my wife's hacking up a lung. Mark does not record a Sermon on the Mount or the Beatitudes.
Is that because he wasn't there for the Sermon on the Mount or the Beatitudes, or?
I would say he was unlikely to be there for any of it.
That was true of all the gospel writers, right?
Yes. The idea that we've kind of grown accustomed to is that the evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are people who were following Jesus around, scribbling on parchment. And that's just not the way it happened. They all write much later after Jesus' death, even Mark, who's the earliest. And as far as, we'll get into who he was, but in a minute, and I'll talk about what Stephen mentioned. So no Christmas story, no Sermon on the Mount, no Beatitudes, no Golden Rule, no Lord's Prayer, no Good Samaritan, no Lazarus, and barely any resurrection story. In fact, the ending of Mark is really abrupt and weird. And we've talked about this before, but if you flip to Mark, 16, I think is where it ends. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the oldest manuscripts that we have end at verse 8 in chapter 16, which is, let's see, a young man appears dressed in white, in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and the women who had gone to the tomb are alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And so whether Mark intended that to be the ending, which is the opinion that I favor because it fits with the rest of his gospel, which is a very human gospel and seems to capture our emotions quite well, or whether there was another part of Mark that got lost, like a back page that fell off at some point, and we just lost it from the earliest manuscripts. You'll never be able to say for sure. But the oldest manuscripts we have, and we have 5 or 6 of them that agree, that was the ending at some point. Later, as Matthew and Luke come on the scene, and John eventually, which is the latest gospel, scribes who were copying the gospels over into different codex at some point decided, either in marginal notes or perhaps in just of their own accord, maybe they thought they were missing material, that couldn't be the way that Mark ended. So they appended the shorter ending of Mark, which is the last part of what becomes verse 8. And all that had been commanded them, they told briefly to those around Peter. And afterwards, Jesus himself sent out through them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. And so for a little while, that was good enough for most scribes. But then somebody else came along later and decided that wasn't a good enough ending. So they added more to it. And that is where you get Mark 16:9 through 20, which is the longer ending and seems to match up more with the other synoptic gospels, Matthew and Luke. Where's A at? If you look at verse 14 in chapter 16, later he appeared to the 11 themselves as they were sitting at the table, and he upbraided them for their lack of faith and stubbornness, because they had not believed those who saw him after he had risen. And there's a note here that says other ancient authorities add in whole or in part. And they, the disciples, excuse themselves, saying, "This age of lawlessness and unbelief is under Satan, who does not allow the truth and power of God to prevail over the unclean things of the spirits. Therefore reveal your righteousness now." Thus they spoke to Christ, and Christ replied to them, "The term of years of Satan's power has been fulfilled, but other terrible things draw near. And for those who have sinned, I was handed over to death, that they may return to the truth and sin no more, that they may inherit the spiritual and imperishable glory of righteousness that is in heaven." So there's a shorter ending, a longer ending, and a longer ending. All because we're not 100% sure how the gospel originally was supposed to end. This is the problem when you're looking at literature that was written 2,000 years ago, long before the printing press and modern paper and all of that. So when we talked before about the text critics and stuff, who can admittedly be overbearing at times and dig into things too deeply, because when you take a sentence and you try to wring meaning from every single word, like Mark was like weighed every single word he wrote down and not just writing out the story, you're eventually going to come to some weird conclusions. But at the very least, they have helped us see that there are multiple endings here that have been added on. It doesn't make them less possible. It just means that they're not necessarily the original ending, and we don't have the original ending. Okay. Questions so far?
I'm glad they added the longer version of Mark, because I used to read before they did that, and I'm like, what happened? I know what happened, but
Right. But I mean, if you think about if we assume that the original ending was the mid part of verse 8, and the women fled from the tomb, they were terrified, they said nothing. Okay, let's just take that as and hypothetically say that is the real ending. The reason I say it matches well with Mark is because, one, Mark is very urgent in his pace, and he has a very good grasp of how people are. And I think most of us would agree that if we went to the tomb of a friend we saw executed 3 days after they died, and instead of finding that body there, we found a random guy dressed in white saying that that person had been risen, and that we were to go tell all of his friends to go gather up in Galilee, I think I probably would have hauled out pretty quick too, because that sounds crazy. It's hard to believe. It's hard for us to believe now, 2,000 years later. Okay, it would have been even harder in the moment. And so, yeah, I think it would be perfectly sensible for the women to run off terrified. And of course, they eventually told somebody, but you know, even when the women do in the other gospels, they're not believed. In all the other gospels, they go tell the men, and the men have to go run and see for themselves because, you know, mansplaining and all that. Um, I think it's probably a realistic ending. It's probably what I would have done. Um, the longer ending helps it match up better with Matthew and Luke, and I agree that's helpful. But if they just left it at the mid part of verse 8, I'd be good with that because at least I'd have one gospel that explains how I feel. Bonnie, you were going to say something a minute ago.
Just that the whole idea of having multiple endings, it's sort of like I can relate that to an unpublished work of a relatively recent author, you know, that somebody goes through his papers after he dies and they find 3 or 4 drafts, or at least different parts of drafts of the same book, and which one do they pick to use as a to publish after he's died. It seems the same to me, that there's bits and pieces that could have been parts that he wrote but said, no, I'm not going to include that.
I mean, we're going through that right now with J.R.R. Tolkien. His son has taken over and is publishing unfinished works. Well, now his son did help some in the actual writing, but I mean, there's no way to tell for sure if this is it's going to turn out the way that J.R.R. Tolkien if initially saw it, you know. And so I'm a little hesitant to read anything besides The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy. So, okay. So now let's get to who wrote the gospel. And we're going to talk about what Stephen said first. So there is a old tradition that somebody named Mark wrote this gospel. Okay. But like most gospels, well, all 4 that are in the Bible, there was no name on the actual manuscript. It's a tradition that somebody named Mark wrote it. And the reality is Mark was an extremely common name in the ancient world. And so Mark would be the equivalent of John in our world today. Like everybody knows John. They're just Johns everywhere. Okay. Mark was like that back in the day. So it's pretty close to an anonymous name. There are some traditions, though, that go with that. Some scholars have said that it could be the Mark that is mentioned in 1 Peter 5, where Peter basically names somebody who's like a son to him. And that probably is also the same Mark mentioned in Acts 12:12. Okay. It could be the Mark that's mentioned by Paul in Philemon and Colossians, and by whoever wrote 2 Timothy. It could be somebody named John Mark, who pops up in Acts and seems to live in Jerusalem, but also seems to travel a lot, so possibly could have been elsewhere. And then there's this odd tradition that identifies the person writing it as somebody who actually appears and makes a cameo in the gospel. So let's see. Jesus before the council. Okay. Turn to Mark 14, starting at verse 43. Mark 14:43. Immediately while Jesus was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived, and with him there was a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Arrest him, and lead him away under guard." So when he came up at once and said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. Then they laid hands on him and arrested him. But one of those who stood near drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Then Jesus said to them, "Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as though I were a bandit? Day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not arrest me. But let the scriptures be fulfilled." All of them deserted him and fled. A certain young man was following him, wearing nothing but a linen cloth. They caught hold of him, but he left the linen cloth and ran off naked. For some reason, there's a tradition that arose from a guy named Papias, who identified the kid that runs off naked as the author of this gospel. Papias is the only one who says anything about it, and we don't actually have Papias's original writings. Papias is quoted by a church historian later called Eusebius, and so we don't have the original of what Papias says. And Papias is probably not a reliable source because he's very wrong about what he's quoted as saying about Matthew. So it's possible there was no Papias and Eusebius was just making things up to fill pages. And this was an interesting tradition that he had heard somewhere or maybe thought up and decided to plug in. But as far as we can tell, the person who ran off naked is just a random person who never appears again. He doesn't even make it into the other gospels. So probably not Mark. The basic or the best we can conclude is that the tradition is old enough that somebody named Mark wrote this gospel, and did so with a purpose. We just probably will never know who the actual Mark was, and that's okay because we don't know who Luke or Matthew or John were either, or if that was really their names. But we have tradition that identifies them with those names. So sometimes you can only go on tradition. And I don't think God's going to hold it against us if we got the name of the Gospels wrong. So that's who wrote the Gospel. Where do you think it was written at?
Greece. Somewhere in Israel, Palestine, I think, or
Okay. Anybody else got a guess?
could have been Egypt.
So there's, again, traditions, right? Rome is a possibility. And the reason is because Koine Greek was actually far more common in the Roman Empire than was Latin for a long time. Latin doesn't really take over until much later. And that's basically because the Romans didn't really invent anything new as far as empire. They just took over the remains of the Greek Empire, and adopted their gods and everything else to their needs, which I guess from a practical standpoint makes sense. Why do the work if somebody's already done the work for you? So, the predominant language in the empire was Koine Greek. So it's possible that Rome is where it was written, and there's two reasons that's possible. if Mark was somebody who was a disciple of Peter, and Peter gets martyred in Rome, same year that Paul does. And so it's possible that the followers of Peter would be in Rome, although they'd probably be trying to keep a very low profile after everything that happened with Peter and Paul. It's also possible that it was written, or let me back up. Another reason it's possible is because Mark has a real focus on persecution and overcoming persecution. And it's entirely possible that he was writing to groups of Gentile Christians who were suffering under Emperor Nero at the time, because the gospel is written about the time that Nero's huge persecutions were going on. And remember that Nero was one of the emperors who used to think it amusing to take Christians, stake them to post in the arena, and light them on fire as his own personal torchlights, and then ride around in there. So to say he was crazy is, yeah. The other possibility is that since the gospel focuses very heavily on the region of Galilee, and that seems to be very important. You start in Galilee, most of Jesus' ministry is in Galilee, quick trip down to die in Jerusalem, and then, according to the longer ending, back to Galilee. And so it's possible that it was written somewhere in Syria to a group of Gentile Christians who were aware of all of the things that had happened in and around Jerusalem with the Jewish wars, were aware that the temple had been destroyed. And, at that point, he would be very focused as the gospel writer on calming their fears, which is why you see a lot of encouragement to people in the gospel dealing with faith matters, because it would have been really hard to be somebody who believed in Jesus, or even a Jew, and watch Jerusalem get destroyed. Especially the temple. So those are the two possibilities: possibly Rome, possibly Syria. There is an older tradition that says possibly Egypt, but that may have got conflated with another gospel, and so it's unlikely it was Egypt. Also, because Mark's language is so simple, though, like I said, a bit deceptively so, it's more likely that he would have been either in Syria or in like the outskirts of Rome. Alexandria in Egypt would have been a much higher culture city, had been Greek longer than Rome had been. So, all right, questions about that? Okay, so we covered who wrote the gospel and where it was written. When was it? So the Jewish war with Rome is between 66 and 70 CE. So roughly 30 years after Jesus dies. That is the most likely date range. So 66 to 74 CE is the most likely date range for when it was written, which would make it the earliest of the Gospels, and would also give the writer, Mark, access to some of the disciples, because some of them would still be alive, to other eyewitnesses, to descendants of the people. And he very well would, or he most certainly would have firsthand knowledge of the destruction of Jerusalem. So all of those kind of combine to point us in that direction, because he has a couple places where he seems to be identifying people that other people would know. Oh, okay. So in Mark 15, verse 21. So this is where the crucifixion of Jesus happens. And it says, they compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry his cross. It was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Now, Simon, Alexander, and Rufus never make another appearance in the Bible. They are never mentioned by anybody else. They're not in any of the Gospels. They're not in Acts or any of Paul's letters. So the way that Mark mentions them, it's like people should know who they are. Like, because otherwise it's just random reference. He could have left it at Simon of Cyrene. He didn't have to name who the sons were. It's like, it's almost him telling you, I got to talk to these people, right? So we're guessing that it's at least a generation back, and he's having access to the descendants and to those who are still alive, which makes for good eyewitness accounts, and means that the authors sought out people who could give him the right traditions. Barbara's still on the phone? Yeah.
Yeah.
She's gonna miss this part and want me to go back. Y'all watch and see. Okay, so if we know it's probably 66 to 74 CE, and possibly Rome, possibly Syria, but definitely almost certainly to a community of Gentile believers, then the question becomes, what was the audience, right? Or maybe more specifically, what was Mark's intent behind writing this? Because this is first of its kind. No gospel has ever been written. And this new writing that Mark doesn't easily fall into any historical category that existed before. You could argue for historical biography, as it was understood back then, but it doesn't share some of the same traits as historical biography or even history, okay? Which is why we classify it as a new tradition, which is gospel, right? The express intent of communicating the good news about somebody you should believe in. So he's writing something brand new. This is the first time this has ever happened. And the question becomes, why is he doing something brand new, right? If you just want to talk about Jesus, preach a sermon. If you want to encourage people about things, well, Paul is well known at the point that Mark is writing. So everybody knows about epistles and sending letters to people. Okay, why not do that? Well, Mark seems very determined to write something out, to write the full story as he understands it, and to get it out to people. Possibly he's doing that because he wants to preserve the story, because people are dying and the eyewitnesses are dying and Jerusalem has been destroyed. And during the war, a lot of false messiahs rose up and said, they were the anointed of God, follow me. And they all pretty much met the same end at the end of a Roman spear. Possibly it was to be a corrective to Paul, because Mark and Paul agree about a lot of things. But if you read Paul's letters, Paul doesn't really care that much about Jesus's life. Paul is focused 100% on what Jesus's death and resurrection means. and he has no problem telling you what to believe. Okay. Whereas Mark actually takes the time to ground the beliefs in the ministry of Jesus. He finds that important. So it's possible that Mark was written to kind of fill in the details about the things Paul was teaching by sharing the story of Jesus that was becoming unfamiliar to people in the far reaches of the empire. Okay. But above all, Mark stresses the openness of Christianity to Gentiles and tries to encourage people in their faith. Okay. He wants to make sure people have right knowledge to believe in, and he wants to make sure they know about Jesus. And so this is why he sets out to do this. Questions, comments, concerns so far? Because the next part we're going to go into is characteristics.
Is this why the other three gospels, I don't want to say stole, borrowed from the book of Mark?
So we can make an argument either way on John, right? Some people would say that John is dependent on Mark as a source, and some people would say that John is completely his own construction and didn't really pay attention to any of the other evangelists who came before him. With Matthew and Luke, they definitely had Mark as a source, okay? But that wasn't their only source. They also had things that are unique to their gospels, which came from traditions that they were aware of or heard of that the other didn't know about. And there's likely a common source shared between them that we don't have a copy of it. We don't know exactly what all was in it besides what they shared, but the idea, the concept behind it is called Q, which comes from the first letter of the German word for source. Kel or something like that. And the reason we say that is because Matthew and Luke have shared material that nobody else has. And so they had to have had something that they used between them. Probably a collection of Jesus's sayings or something like that that was written down somewhere. But yes, Matthew and Luke are definitely indebted to Mark as far as a primary source, which makes sense because they write roughly 20 years after Mark. And so by their generation, all the eyewitnesses are gone. Okay, there's nobody left who was there with Jesus. And so they're using Mark as the next best thing to an eyewitness account.
Right.
So they understand where he got his sources from. So, Barbara, you back with us?
I am. That was a name that's on the list, on the prayer list. And she's had all kind of complications from chemo. That's bad news. But I missed a lot. But I did get it on mute.
So, basically all we talked about while you were gone was where it was written, which Rome is possible or Syria, and when it was written, which is most likely between 66 and 74 CE, and then the audience, which is most likely a community of Gentile believers, and that this gospel was probably meant to preserve the story in the face of the false messiahs that rose up during the Jewish war, and could have been meant to be a corrective to Paul's letters, because Paul has this habit of only focusing on Jesus's death and resurrection and then telling you what to believe. Whereas Mark shares a lot of those thoughts, but grounds it in the story of Jesus. And Paul's letters would have been around when Mark was writing, so he would know the deficiencies thereof. and possibly some of the Pauline letters that we know seem to have existed, but we never got to see. So now we're going to go into the last part of this behind the scenes picture, and that's the characteristics of Mark. So Mark is told, or Mark's gospel is very urgent. Okay, from the very beginning, no Christmas story, just straight in. This is Jesus. He's the Son of God. This is what the prophet said. And now, bang, here's John the Baptist. And as soon as Jesus comes out of the water, as you'll hear Sunday, the Spirit's there, and God rips back the heavens and declares him to be his son. And then we're off to the races. Okay. Mark's favorite word by far is a Greek word, ethous,
What?
which means ethous, which means immediately. Okay. Mark uses it 42 times in his gospel, which is impressive considering it's a short gospel. He uses it 11 times in the first chapter alone. You will sometimes see it translated as immediately in English, but because it gets repetitive to hear immediately this and immediately that and immediately this, they also take some translation license and change the word occasionally, so it's not immediately, so on and so forth. But Mark is very much concerned to get this story out as quickly as possible to the most amount of people as possible. And he has a frenetic pace throughout until we get to the Passion story. Mark is also very, very insistent that Jesus is coming back soon, which is also what Paul thought, okay, and what most of Jesus's followers thought. Okay, they were pretty convinced that any day now Jesus was going to pop back in glory, and it was just going to be the end of all things. So that's the first characteristic. It's a very urgent story, and immediately is a favorite one. The second is that Mark has a tendency to emphasize Jesus's deeds over his words. So if you look at the stories that Mark shares, there is much less space devoted to Jesus's teaching than there is in Matthew, Luke, or John. They expound on Jesus's teachings, and that's why you get the Sermon on the Mountain or the Sermon on the Plain, whichever one it was. That's why Jesus goes on these really long tangents in John and just talks in the most complicated Greek sentences you'll ever come across in your life, except maybe in the letters of Paul.
Yeah.
But Mark shares proportionally more miracle stories than all the other Gospels. So he is much more concerned about what Jesus did and what it means for people than necessarily what Jesus said. So you end up with this presentation of Jesus in which he doesn't talk a whole lot. He doesn't teach a whole lot. He does teach some, but for the most part, he's doing. Okay. There's more healing stories. There's more miracle stories. The third characteristic is that the story is dominated by the passion narrative at the end. Okay. Jesus' ministry on earth was about 3 years long. Matthew and Luke pretty much account for all of that. John focuses in on it, but Mark manages to tell the story of Jesus' ministry. Let's see. Course. Tenants. Yeah, Mark manages to tell it in about 12 chapters. And then Jesus in Jerusalem. And when we get to Jerusalem, the story slows way down. Okay, we go from this immediately Jesus to suddenly we're talking about the events as they happen day by day, even hour by hour. So the pace slows down to a glacial pace. And it's because Mark wants you to know that this is the most important part of the story. Okay, this is what all the deeds have led up to, all the teaching has led up to, what the very purpose of Jesus is, which is to be submissive to God's will and to suffer on the behalf of mankind to save them from themselves. And so he takes his most careful time with the passion narrative and does his best writing there. The fourth is that this gospel comes off as simpler than the other gospels. And it's fair in a way because the language is less refined than Matthew, Luke, and John. But it's also more colorful. So whoever Mark was, he was probably hanging out on the backside of the markets, learning all those good words that we're not supposed to say. Because it doesn't make it across in the English, but Mark's got a little bit of a mouth. And you know, Paul did too. Paul is not afraid to say that he considers all the things that he was and is as a Pharisee and righteous before the Lord in all these different ways and everything. He considers that skubala, which is Greek for doo-doo. It's a nice way to say it. But it translates quite literally to the cuss word. So, yeah. And Mark has several instances of that as well. So there you go. You didn't know there was cussing in scripture, did you? All right. The next characteristic is that Mark, even though it appears simple, makes really good use of different literary devices. So Jesus foreshadows what's going to happen to him 3 times. He predicts it almost from the very beginning. Okay. And each time there's a little bit more depth, and it's preparing us for what comes at the end. Okay. We also see a lot of 2-step progressions. And what that means is that Jesus will say to the disciples, you know, go get a boat ready for us this evening. And then it follows up with later that evening, they got into the boat that they had prepared. Okay, so basically it's prepping you for what's coming next and then telling the story itself. And then he also likes to use what's called intercalation. What that basically is where he tells a story within a story.
Could you spell it?
Yeah, give me just a second. So it's INTERCALATION.
Okay.
I had it right, and that's a miracle because I can't spell.
So this is placing a story within a story. So in Mark 6, Jesus sends out the disciples on their missionary journey, right? Go out, cure the sick, heal the hurt, and then come back, right? As soon as the disciples leave, Mark cuts what they're doing and talks about Herod's reaction to John the Baptist and his execution and what he thinks about Jesus. And then as soon as he tells that part of the story, he comes back to the disciples returning and telling Jesus about what they did. So it's a story within a story that helps move the plot along.
Okay, how long were the disciples gone when Jesus sent them out? Because if they were a year, then his ministry was only 2 years, wasn't it? Or am I wrong?
I'm not sure that there's any particular place that tells us how long they were gone. Matthew and Luke expand a little bit on it and talk about some of the things Jesus was doing in the in-between time, which makes it seem like a good while. But I mean, they would have had to been gone for a while, because it's not like Jesus was up there in Galilee and he was like, all right, go heal the people. And then they were flagging down Ubers and taking buses and stuff on paved roads. You know, they're like striking out for these tiny little villages in pairs of two, doing the best they can to get there and then to go on to the next place. So it would have been a while. I'm just not sure exactly how long.
So I always thought about that.
Yeah. And I mean, I wouldn't expect Mark to tell us exactly how long, just because he's not really concerned with the disciples' mission. He's concerned with the results of it and then moving on to the next thing, because what he really wants to get to is the passion. So, all right. Next theme is there is a very, very pronounced focus on Galilee. Okay. Galilee is the place where Jesus begins and begins his ministry and has the most success in his ministry. It's where he does most of his teaching. And it's where the disciples are expected to return to after Jesus dies and is resurrected. So there's a very pronounced focus on Galilee. And so there again is one of the reasons why Syria is a possibility, is a place where the book could have been, or the gospel could have been written, because they would be concerned about Galilee. It's right there near them, and they certainly would be concerned about fellow Christians who were trying to escape the Roman crackdown. The next thing is that this gospel is definitely for a Gentile audience. It makes very clear that Gentiles are welcome within Christianity, which is also something Paul does. We also see Jesus when the Pharisees get all bent out of shape because the disciples didn't wash their hands. Jesus takes that and expounds upon it, ultimately declaring that all food is clean, that no food defiles. And he kind of took it in a weird direction, because the purity laws around food were not necessarily meant to keep you from ritual defilement, but were more intended to keep you safe. So, it wasn't necessarily safe to eat pork in the ancient world. It certainly wasn't safe to eat shellfish in the ancient world without refrigeration. And so, a lot of the dietary restrictions were meant to keep you healthy. But Mark takes it as a purity issue and has Jesus declare, you don't have to wash your hands, which I would say you do. You do need to wash your hands. And also that all food is clean. Questions so far? Because I've got 3 more. Good, you with me?
Mhm. I'm here
Okay. All right. So
taking notes.
yeah. The next thing is that this gospel presents the most human portrait of Jesus. Okay. You see it some in the other gospels, but in this gospel, very much so. Jesus gets angry. Jesus gets sad. Jesus gets frustrated. Okay. He has all of the emotions that we have. Jesus gets tired and sleeps. Okay. It's a very human portrait of Jesus. Even when we think about him meeting the woman, I think in this gospel, it's the Canaanite woman because it's a Syrophoenician in Luke or Matthew. The one he calls a dog, right?
Hmm.
And she responds back to him, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs eat the crumbs from underneath the master's table." And that response actually makes Jesus stop and think and change his mind, because by her response, he has more clearly seen what God's plan is. And so he does as she asked. So we see Jesus change his mind. You don't really get that implication in the other gospels, but it's important to note that here, that had that woman not been persistent and stood up to Jesus when he was basically saying, "I don't have to pay attention to you," which is not the Jesus we want to think about, he wouldn't have changed his mind. But because she was willing to do that, he did. The next one is my favorite one, and that is what's called the Messianic secret. Okay. And what that is throughout the Gospel of Mark, nobody's supposed to know who Jesus is. Okay. When the disciples finally figure it out and Peter makes his great confession, the first thing Jesus does is basically turn around and go, "Shut up. Don't tell anybody. Keep it to yourself and let's get on with what we got to do." Okay. Anytime Jesus heals somebody, invariably he goes, "Go forth, sin no more, tell no one." Okay. And of course, every single person runs off and tells everybody as soon as they can. Okay. So it's not a well kept secret, but Jesus is very concerned in the Gospel of Mark to keep the secret until it's time. And most people respond to that by not being able to do that because the goodness of God has been so great in their life, they can't help but tell everybody. So I find it real fun to be with Jesus as he's going around telling these people, knowing that they're immediately going to go tell everybody. Like you just as well got on a loudspeaker and said, "Jesus, the Son of God, is here, and he's handing out free miracles," because they're not going to stay quiet. And then the last one is an interesting one too. The failure of the disciples. Mark is not kind to the disciples. And I think that's the biggest factor that mitigates it being, or the author, Mark, being a disciple of Peter. Because especially Peter, they do not come off looking good at the end of the gospel and throughout the gospel. Okay. Every story with the disciples is some pattern of Jesus teaches them, they get it wrong, he corrects them, they still get it wrong. Okay. They repeatedly show a lack of faith. They abandon him at his crucifixion. Okay. Peter denies him. They are not good at this following Jesus thing. And that's a difference from what we see in the other gospels. The other gospels present redeeming qualities of the disciples and show that they grew throughout the mission. Mark doesn't think they grew at all. Mark thinks they're just idiots and that they messed everything up. And he is very clear about that from beginning to end. The reason is because we are supposed to use them as a negative example as we read this. This is basically an example of what you should not do. If you're going to follow Jesus, you should not let his teachings go through one ear and out the other and then immediately go do whatever you want. Because when you do that, you're not following Jesus. And so the disciples become a negative example for us to not imitate so that Jesus and his mission are accomplished. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
So, and there's a whole list of themes in this gospel. You know, we've talked about characteristics here, but there's a whole list of themes that we'll talk about as we go through. And most of where I'm pulling this from is my New Testament textbook from seminary, which is a little outdated now. And this book, which is The Fortress Introduction to the Gospels by Mark Allen Powell. This is printed by Augsburg Fortress. And if you want to pick one up, they're not expensive. I think they're like $15, but it covers introductions to all four Gospels, and it has some really good information in it. Mark Allen Powell is probably one of the preeminent New Testament scholars, and we are lucky that he is a member of the ELCA and a professor at one of our seminaries. Matter of fact, that's Harrington. That's lame. One of my commentaries is by Mark Allen Powell too, but that's neither here nor there. So we're at 8:08 p.m. So questions, comments, things I confuse you on?
This is not anything we've covered, but I hope maybe we will. I don't understand why, and it may be it's just the Bibles that we use. Jesus is portrayed as so fair. I don't understand when all of his ancestors were of a darker skin.
So the Bible doesn't actually portray him as fair. It's us in Western Christianity that have done that.
I thought that might be the case.
Yeah, and a lot of it, we talked about this during the Advent services. A lot of it has to do with the fact that we naturally see people we imagine, and we all have an imaginary image of Jesus, as looking a bit like ourselves. And so it's natural for us to kind of picture Jesus as white. I think the extreme version of that is when he comes out with blue eyes and blonde hair, because that's not Middle Eastern. That's German. But the reality is Jesus would have been olive skinned and had dark hair, and I mean he was Middle Eastern. So it's just our imaginations that have changed over the years because we've gotten separated from where Christianity started, and now we're pretty convinced that the center of Christianity is the Western world. So, other thoughts, comments, questions, concerns?
Well, off the subject, today in history, 502 years ago, Martin Luther was excommunicated.
He's still
And
excommunicated.
I've read that and I was like,
yeah. So we've had ongoing conversation with the Roman Catholic Church for about the last 25 years, and it's produced a few things. The most important one was the Joint Declaration on the Doctrine of the Way, which is a really long and complicated way of saying how do we get to salvation, where the Roman Catholic Church actually made the admission in writing that salvation and justification comes through Christ alone. But then doubled down on the works necessary, and they're also still doing indulgences. I found that out a couple weeks ago. I did not know that, but apparently, if you go pray to a nativity scene at a Franciscan church, apparently you will be issued a special indulgence. And I went down a rabbit hole with that for a while. So, if anybody needs an indulgence, there's a Franciscan church in Charleston. Just go pray to their nativity scene. They'll pop one out for you. But despite the conversations we've had with the Catholic Church, there are a few points of dispute that continue. And one of them is the excommunication of all the reformers, because they have not rescinded those. They declare all of the reformers to be heretics and have excommunicated them. Of course, all the reformers then, in their own traditions, excommunicated the Pope. And so until we take those back, we actually have no basis of real conversation, because, you know, you can't declare the founder of the denomination to be a heretic and not expect all of the rest of the people who were in that denomination to be considered heretics too. And it pops up in weird ways. Like, my daughter's school is a Catholic school. They will not call me pastor there. They refuse.
No, I'm sorry.
I am.
What do they call you?
I am Mr. Knudsen.
Mm.
At all times. So the last time I went to a mass was down in Charleston, but the last time they had mass at the school last year, and Lexi's class was helping, I dressed all up. I wore my black shirt with my tab and my black pants, and I went in there and sat as close to the front as I could, and just smiled the whole time. The priest came up to me afterward. He's like, hi. I was like, hi. He goes, where are you from? I said, oh, I'm the pastor at St. Michael Lutheran and Christ Community Lutheran. My daughter goes here.
Sounds like you left him speechless.
Yeah, he was like, well, it's good to meet you. And then he walked away. So,
You rebel.
oh, Rosie, next time I'm going in my cassock.
You did.
Just don't spill wine on it.
Except the priest. I guess that's right. I did go to her Christmas program in my cassock. That was at St. Teresa's out on Dorchester Road. And that same priest is the priest there. And so he came up to me. He was like, hey, how are you? I said, I'm good. How are you? He goes, you look good. I said, thank you. So, all right. Well, none of that is here or there. So any other questions about Mark and the background thereof?
How old do you think Mark was when he wrote this? A young man?
I doubt he was that young, but I mean, in the ancient world, most people didn't live, you know, to see 60. So probably late 30s, early 40s. Old enough basically old enough to make connections, at least with the next generation of descendants from the disciples and those people who had seen what Jesus had done. Because he definitely references several times people that it seems like he thinks everybody knows, but that we never hear about again. Like Simon of Cyrene and his sons Alexander and Rufus. They never come again. And the naked kid in the garden. So you would think that would have been like, if somebody just ran off naked, you would think the other gospels would have like, yeah, we got to mention that. But apparently not. So. All right. If there are no more questions or comments, then we will leave it here for tonight. And next week, we will talk about the first couple chapters, and I'll get you a reading list so you know what to read ahead of time.
Thank you.
Yes?
Thank you. Right.
All
And
right.
I will not be to church Sunday.
That's unacceptable.
I know.
You better go pray at that Franciscan church and get an indulgence for your absence.
Okay.
'Cause
Oh, good.
I either want that or an excuse signed by Jesus.
Okay.
Kathy, if you're not going to be there,
Yes,
If,
ma'am.
if I get this, these prayer circle lists done, I'll pass them out to the people that used to attend but no longer do, hoping that will
Okay.
encourage them, right? Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll see what I can do.
Okay.
Barbara,
Yes,
Barbara, if you're going to send it as an attachment to Rosie to print off, why don't you send it that way to Kathy as well?
I don't think she prints.
Hmm.
No, I don't.
Oh, okay. Never mind.
That's
I don't
okay.
have a friend.
I've been
Okay.
down that
That was a-
road.
That was a good idea, so
Printers are very inexpensive,
I know,
but you have to have somewhere to sit it.
yeah. And but I don't have that much room in my room to put all that stuff.
No, I
And,
understand.
All right. Y'all have a good night.
You too,
You
Pastor.
too.
Good
You as
night.
well.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.